Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl, and today I am reviewing and discussing Devil's Gate by David Roberts. A few months ago, I heard about this book, and it was recommended very highly to me. And since my ancestors were pioneers, some of them handcart pioneers, it really intrigued me, and I've always been interested in what the pioneers went through, and being told that there were things I didn't know about this time period and about the pioneers also intrigued me. And so I knew that I wanted to get to this. What I didn't know was going to happen was that when I read it, that I was going to learn so much, that it would affect me the way it did, and that I would feel such a drive to do a deep dive on this the way I have on other books, because I feel like it's really important that people know the real story, the whole story, I should say, because stories that we hear about the handcart pioneers and the pioneers in general, whether it's Mormon or other, they are true, but there's so much more to the story than we usually learn, especially when it's the Mormon pioneers. There are so many things that we've been told and that we're taught, or that just go around in the culture that are just blatantly false. And I think it's really important that people know it, because it doesn't take away. Let me make that very clear for anyone who is Mormon that is watching this. In no way is a video of me talking about the truths that you might not know. That doesn't take away from what they went through. I don't want to take away from the pioneers themselves, the regular everyday people. Those were people that gave up everything for something they believed in, and they deserve to be remembered and honored. So don't go into this video thinking I'm going to be making up stuff about them or that I am trying to dishonor them. I'm actually trying to honor them further, because you deserve to know exactly why they went through what they did, and to know that some of the things that we've been told afterward are not true. So this is the fact-based full story of the handcart pioneers. First, I want to do just a review of the book, so that if you are coming on here and you want to read the book, I'm not going to be spoiling anything for you. You can hear my review and then you can turn it off and come back after you've read it. Devil's Gate tells the story of the 1856 handcart pioneer tragedies. I'm going to read a part of the blurb on the back of this book. The story of the 1856 Mormon handcart tragedy has never before been told in full, despite its stunning human drama. Far more people died in the Mormon tragedy than died in the more famous Donner Party disaster. It is the worst tragedy in the history of the Western migrations, and yet it remains virtually unknown today outside of Mormon circles. 9 years after establishing a new Zion in what is now Salt Lake City, Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders conceived a plan to bring thousands of impoverished European converts from the Old World to Zion. The European Mormons would travel by ship to New York City and by train to Iowa City. From there, instead of crossing the plains by covered wagon, they would push and pull wooden handcarts all the way west. But the handcart plan was badly flawed, and ultimately many of the new immigrants succumbed to the lack of adequate provisions and the demanding physical labor of crossing 1,300 miles of plains and mountains. David Roberts did his research for this book in the LDS archives and on his own travels. He traveled the route that they took multiple times and talked with the people at the visitor center, pulled a handcart himself, and he tells the story of some of the people more in detail, gives quotes directly from people's journals, and he tells what was going on in Utah at the time and what has happened since. I think that everyone interested in pioneers should read this, whether you're LDS or not. This is certainly not anti-Mormon literature. The only thing that would keep somebody from reading this is if they don't want to read something negative about church leaders. If that is the case, then I don't know what to tell you, because they did a lot of horrible things. They still do a lot of horrible things. And there is a lot of information, movies, books out there that will tell you the story of these pioneers, but nobody is going to give you the full story in the way that he does. If all you care about is hearing the story that's going to make you feel good, then that's not honoring the people that went through it either. So I definitely recommend it. And now I'm going to get into a discussion of what he says in this book and some of the information. So if you haven't read it yet and you don't want to be spoiled, now is the time to drop off. If you don't mind being spoiled and you just want to hear about this, then I hope that this will be informative and interesting to you. I have created a map here behind me of the Mormon Trail. My daughters are artists, I am not. So it is not well done, and it is not completely to scale. It's to give a general idea as I'm talking, and I can put pictures up of little handcarts and wagons on it so that you can kind of get an idea of where the people are along the trail when things happen. So if you want to correct me, you don't need to. I know that it's not completely accurate to scale. I just drew it really fast just to kind of give a general idea. As I talk today, I'm going to be using quotes from my own ancestors, this book. I'm also going to be taking a few quotes from teachings of the presidents of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley. This is put out by the LDS Church a few years ago. And I will occasionally be showing pictures, paintings that were painted by my ancestors, CCA Christensen, that come from this book. Another source that I read through was this book, I Walk to Zion. I bought this book at BYU when I was 18 years old. It tells the story of quite a few pioneers and from different companies, not just the handcart companies. But the thing is that it mostly just gives the good things. And if there is something hard, it really minimizes it. And so it was interesting to read this. So if you have this book or you've read this book, you might want to go to the original sources and see what there is more to their stories. The first thing I want to talk about is, in the LDS Church, what are we told about our Mormon pioneer ancestors and why? And then what is the truth? And why does it matter? Every year in Utah, July 24th is celebrated. And here in Utah, it is a very big holiday. And when I was growing up, a lot of times it was bigger than the 4th of July. You go to fireworks and there are big parades. People dress up in pioneer clothes. When we lived in Wisconsin, our ward, which was our church group there, would get together and have a big Pioneer Day party, and you'd play pioneer games. So it is a big holiday for everybody. And the Sunday right before Pioneer Day, there will usually be a special meeting at church where all the talks are about pioneers. You're singing the songs about the pioneers and things like that. In fact, in Wisconsin one year, I was one of the speakers for the Pioneer Day special meeting. And again, it's always, you're hearing the good stories. There are movies out. Legacy is one. 17 Miracles is a recent one that I loved for many years. It will make you cry. It is very heartwarming, very inspiring, even though they actually do show a couple of the really hard things that should make people kind of question things sometimes, but they also add in some things that they shouldn't have and don't tell you the whole story about a lot of things in that as well. So we're always given this really epic story about all of the miracles that happened. Like most Mormon things, you're not supposed to dwell on the harder things. You're not supposed to spend much time there. We are kind of trained in the Mormon church that if something feels bad, you turn away from it. So that is why most people aren't going to find out the truth about Joseph Smith. They're not going to find out the truth about a lot of things, because as soon as somebody like me starts talking about it, they get a bad feeling and it makes them feel bad. And so they assume you're telling lies. It's not right. They shouldn't be listening. They're going to leave. And so while they can show the hard things that happened, if they don't do it in a faith promoting way that makes you feel elevated emotion, they're not going to do it, because they don't want you to think too much about the hard things and why they happen. Every year, just about, I think every summer, groups of youth, especially in the LDS Church, will go on what is called trek. And they will don their pioneer clothes, although they're usually going to be wearing sneakers and not the kind of shoes that pioneers would have actually been wearing. And they will go out in the desert or go up to Wyoming, and they will pull handcarts for a few days. They have food and water. Kids have gotten injured on this before, but for the most part, they're making it safer. But then it's so hard that it kind of gives us false assumption to the people that are involved in it that they now know what the pioneers went through. And they don't realize how much more it was than just pulling heavy things. And also, if someone were to ask me about the Mormon pioneers and the things that I knew for sure, I would say that I knew that except these two handcart companies, the death rate of Mormon pioneers coming across wasn't any higher than anybody else that was a pioneer. I would have said that this area was not traveled very much and that no one really knew what to expect. So anything bad that happened wasn't the problem of bad planning. I would have told you that when Brigham Young got to Immigration Canyon here in Utah, that he looked out and he didn't know where they were going to stop. And he said, this is the place. And so they decided to stay here. And I would have said that no handcart company people ever left the church, because those are the truths that you're told. And you'll find out today that none of those are true. In this Teachings of the Presidents of the Church, Gordon B. Hinckley, on page 83, Gordon B. Hinckley said, "It was by faith that Brigham Young looked over the Salt Lake Valley, then hot and barren, and declared, 'This is the place.'" So this is something we have been told as a fact. He for sure said this, and he didn't know where they were going. So one thing that I will just mention right up front before I even get into the rest of it is that there were actually already people from his party that were down in the valley already planting and digging canals and things before he ever got to that spot. And It is very highly debated whether he even said the words, "This is the place." It is believed that he did not. Some people will argue it. It doesn't really matter if he did or not, because it didn't happen in the way we're told. If you go down up to that canyon now, there is a big park called This Is the Place Heritage Park with a giant statue of him. Most people don't know that there were actually slaves that were down in the valley already. Of course, that was another thing I was taught growing up, is that Mormons were against slavery, but there were families that had slaves, and the slaves were some of the first people in the Salt Lake Valley preparing the valley for the pioneers to come. So I think that's a really important fact to know, that this is the place may be one of the biggest lies that we are told. I've told you what we are told in the church and what we believe about our ancestors. And now I'm going to start talking about what the truth of the whole thing is, and telling you more about it and what really happened and why. When I am done telling the story, then the last section will be me saying what the aftermath was, what happened right afterward, and what is still happening to this day that I believe dishonors the people that went through this. This will be broken up into 3 videos. So I'm going to go right to Devil's Gate, to this book. On page 2, he says, in 1856, the immigrants were not traveling as Brigham Young's party had in covered wagons pulled by oxen. That is one of the other important things to know going into a true story of the pioneers, is that there were a lot of wagon companies. There were, I don't even know how many wagon companies there were. There were so many of them. And these companies would have a bunch of wagons, a lot of people, so they would have a lot of supplies. Brigham Young's very first trip, because he did, I think, do it twice, but his first trip in 1847 was called the Vanguard Company. And he had 142 men, 3 wives, and 2 children. Originally, it was supposed to be just men, but then they ended up having a couple of women and children along. And so this would be a little bit smaller even than some of the later wagon trains, but this one had that many people, and then it had 72 wagons, 93 horses and 52 mules, 66 oxen, 19 cows, 17 dogs, and a few chickens. And this wagon train had 0 deaths. So there was a lot of sickness, just like most pioneers of any kind would have had. Disease was usually the biggest form of death for any kind of pioneer. And the most common diseases were cholera, dysentery, mountain fever, which they specify as spotted, typhoid, or scarlet, measles, food poisoning, scurvy, smallpox, and pneumonia. So that would be something common. And Brigham Young actually did. He had mountain fever when they were coming into the valley. So that was pretty normal for there to be disease and sickness along the way. But they had no deaths. So if we look at just his wagon train, then it seems pretty safe. And I think that would have been the experience for most wagon companies. However, I will give some percentages at the end, and you will see that the Mormon average was higher than the non-Mormon average, especially with handcarts, but even with the wagons, it was a little bit. He says the handcart experiment was Brigham Young's idea, and the bottom line was economic. So who is Brigham Young? If you're not LDS, you might not know who he is. You might have heard me mention him in other videos before. Brigham Young was the 2nd president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In this book, when he's talking a little bit about Brigham Young, he says that traveling all over the region, Joseph Smith slowly but doggedly made converts. One of the first to fall under his spell was Brigham Young, who had moved in 1829 to Mendon, a village only 15 miles southwest of Palmyra. 28 years old, married, with a 3-year-old daughter, Young was eking out a living like his father, making chairs and baskets that he sold door to door. Even Brigham Young was not an instant convert. When he was 22 years old, he had joined the Methodist Church, but he wasn't completely satisfied. And so he was attending churches everywhere from Presbyterian to Quaker. And then one day his brother Phineas gave him a Book of Mormon. This would have been very soon after it was published for the first time. He read through it, and he was not instantly converted even by reading it. He held on to it for 2 years before he decided that he did believe in it. Brigham Young said that he only had 11 days of formal schooling in his whole life, and most of the letters that he wrote as prophet were written by scribes. So people aren't quite sure exactly how literate he was, but he did give a lot of speeches, and there are instances of people talking about seeing him reading, and one of his wives, Annalisa Young, said that he would lose his temper every morning over his reading of the Salt Lake Tribune. But on April 15th, 1832, he was baptized into the LDS Church. I have talked a lot in the history videos that I have done on here about the early church, and so if you want to know more about Joseph Smith and how the church started and all of the history leading up to when Joseph Smith died. You can go and watch those videos. Right now I'm going to go into Nauvoo, and this would have been right before Joseph Smith died. The first British converts, 200 strong, arrived in Nauvoo in 1840. 2 years later, the influx numbered 1,600. Nauvoo started to burst at the seams. In 1842, its population was counted at around 7,000. In a mere 3 years of existence, the town had become the largest in Illinois. By 1844, Nauvoo's population would swell to 12,000. During this chapter, where he's talking about the history of the church, he actually references Fawn Brodie, and that is the book that I did all the history about. And he also references Under the Banner of Heaven. And so if you've watched all of those videos and then you read this book, you'll know what he's talking about there. But he starts talking about the paranoia that's growing in Nauvoo and the violence that's really starting to escalate again there. And then he tells about how Joseph Smith died. In here it says, at the time of the prophet's martyrdom, most of the apostles were scattered about the eastern states. Brigham Young, who had risen to the rank of the president of the 12, was in Massachusetts. Ironically, on July 1st, 4 days after Smith's death, he and 2 other Mormon elders spoke at the Boston Melodian, vigorously advancing the prophet's candidacy for president. They didn't learn of the murder for another 15 days. When he did, he immediately set out to return to Illinois, but it would not be until August 6th that he arrived in Nauvoo. Sidney Rigdon was in Pittsburgh when he got the news. He too rushed at once to Nauvoo, arriving there 3 days before Brigham Young. Nobody knew who should be in charge of the church next. Sidney Rigdon was kind of the obvious answer to this. He had been with the church almost since the very beginning. He had kind of been Joseph Smith's second-hand man for so long. On August 8th, all of Nauvoo gathered together in a grove overlooking the Mississippi River to discuss who the future leader should be. I'm going to read from the book here. One of the most cherished of Mormon myths would attach itself to this gathering. According to this tradition, after other pretenders to the vacant throne of the prophet had advanced their candidacies, Rigdon addressed the throng as the last speaker. By now he was 51 years old, decidedly portly with an unimpressive bearing, but his smooth and tempered oration seemed to win the day, and the crowd was on the verge of conferring the leadership on Rigdon by unanimous acclamation. But then, according to the myth, a cry rang out. A steamboat was approaching on the Mississippi River, with Brigham Young aboard. There would be one last speaker. One historian calls Young's oration that August day the most famous speech in Mormon history. The mythologizing tradition has transformed into a miracle. Basically, what they say is a lot of the people said that as Brigham Young was speaking, that he took on the countenance and the voice of Joseph Smith. It's so funny because other people that were there said that never happened, but that some people did imagine that. But it has become the myth that everybody saw that happen. We also know that there was no last-minute steamboat arrival. By the time the open-air meeting was held, Young had been in Nauvoo for 2 days already. And so when you hear people telling this story, you already know that half of it is completely made up. This is where Brigham Young was really smart. It actually looks like he had a strategy. Rigdon had announced that the prophet had visited him in a vision and entrusted him with the governing of the church. But Young got up and scolded the congregation for convening a meeting to decide Smith's successor rather than mourning his death, and he feigned disinterest. He said, "I do not care who leads this church. You cannot fill the office of a prophet, seer, and revelator. God must do this. You are like children without a father." And he did not put himself forth as a candidate for this. It was a question, he said, of sustaining the quorum of 12 apostles or of voting for Rigdon. And so he called for a show of hands. How many there would vote to sustain the 12? And of course, all the hands shot up. And then he said how many wouldn't, and only a few of them dared to put their hands up. So Rigdon was trounced as the candidate, and before it could even come to a vote. As a biographer, Morris Werner, puts it, the meeting then adjourned until the church conference the following October, and the church was in the hands of the 12, who were in the hands of Brigham Young. So after that, Brigham Young then goes about discrediting Sidney Rigdon. He brought him to trial on charges ranging from illegally ordaining priests to having false revelations. So Rigdon was then excommunicated by the 12 and sent packing as the congregation unanimously, quote, delivered him over to the buffetings of Satan. So Brigham is now in control of the church. He would be the president for the next 33 years. During those first couple of years, it was all he could do to hold it together. It was a very hard job. And there was a man named James Strang, who I have talked about in a previous video, who also believed that he was to be the one in charge. And so he ended up setting up his own church in Wisconsin. And by 1846, he reportedly had 10,000, 2/3 as many as the faithful in and around Nauvoo. But the greatest threat to Brigham's supremacy came in the form of Joseph Smith's family. Lucy Smith claimed to have received visions conferring the succession to William. Emma, Joseph's wife, believed that her son was supposed to be the next in line. They ended up following the Strangs for a while, and then they established their own church, the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that actually still exists today. This was all going on in Nauvoo, and also new frictions were starting to arise because on September 16th, 1845, Porter Rockwell murdered Franklin Worrell, one of the leaders of the Carthage Greys, the militia that had collaborated with the Warsaw Dragoons to kill Joseph Smith. So in response, the Gentiles attacked the Mormon town of Lima, burning down 175 houses. A handful of further killings on both sides after that, and they started to get a lot of threats. In 1845, the Illinois legislature revoked the charter for Nauvoo, and they knew that they had to go elsewhere. So only months before abandoning Nauvoo, they erected the temple. They finished building it, even though they knew they were going to be leaving. Mormons claimed that it cost $600,000, which the writer says that he believes that was a wildly inflated figure. But they believed that it had been ordained by God through Joseph Smith to build it, so they had to build it before they left. But he speculates here, and a lot of other people have speculated, that the reason that Brigham Young might have wanted to finish it was to try to sell it, because the temple, in fact, was put up for sale. But nobody bought it. They weren't able to sell it. A fire in 1848 and then a tornado in 1850 destroyed much of it, and the citizens of what was left of Nauvoo pushed down the remaining walls. In the early 2000s, they did rebuild it, and in 2002, it was dedicated by Gordon B. Hinckley, and it still stands as a fully functioning temple again now. During the last weeks in Nauvoo, more than 1,000 saints received their ordinances in the temple. And among them was Brigham Young, who was sealed to 34 of the 35 wives he had taken by early 1846. It's interesting that Brigham Young is very well known for his polygamy in the LDS Church, even by faithful members, while Joseph Smith is not as well known. And yet, Young would always insist that when the doctrine of plural marriage was first revealed to him by Joseph Smith, that he was revolted, that he didn't want to do it. But he obviously eventually grew to enjoy polygamy because he also had a lot of brides once he came to Utah, and some of them as young as 14, like Joseph Smith's youngest wife. Early in February 1846, Young led some 2,000 followers west across the Mississippi, and they turned their back on Nauvoo for good. As he took the saints out of Nauvoo, Brigham Young realized there's no way he could transport all of these people at one time to a new place. They had decided that they wanted to leave the United States and into the West. So they decided to build a kind of wintering over settlement. He writes here, the decision to winter over was sealed by the arrival in Mount Pisgah on June 26th of a 4-man military delegation that had traveled east from Fort Leavenworth in what is today Kansas. The Mexican War had broken out. Since taking office in 1845, President James K. Polk had agonized over the Mormon situation. Now he performed a brilliant stroke of co-option. The delegation brought the president's formal request for 500 Mormon volunteers to join General Stephen Watts Kearny's Army of the West as it marched to Santa Fe and Southern California. If Mormons could be coerced to serve the cause of the United States, that would seriously blunt the edge of their threat to flee the country's confines to establish their autonomous Zion in the wilderness. The request for volunteers proved an unexpected windfall. The Army pay for 500 volunteers for a year's service amounted to $21,000, of which Parley Pratt, acting for Brigham Young, managed to secure as much as 6,000 in pledges to bolster the colony of overwintering saints. In addition, the Army would effectively pay the way to Zion for 500 saints who would otherwise have had to finance their own pilgrimage. They are going to get money for this, which is something I never knew about the Mormon Battalion. That is what the men that left and did go volunteer ended up being called. And I didn't know that the church made a profit from that, but they did. In the fall of 1846, on either side of the Missouri River, the Mormons started building houses. On the east side in Iowa Territory, they constructed Miller's Hollow, soon to be renamed Canesville, then Council Bluffs. Okay, so back here behind me on this very far edge of the map is Council Bluffs and Winter Quarters, where they are going to be staying over for the winter. Winter Quarters was later renamed Florence. Brigham Young gave up his plan to immediately go out on an advance party and wintered over as well. A year-end census counted 3,483 people in winter quarters. Only 502 of those were men because of the Mormon Battalion. It was built in the standard Mormon grid that if you come here to Utah, most cities are built in a squared off grid. So the streets are numbered, and that became the standard Mormon grid. There were 538 wooden houses, most of them made of cottonwood, and 83 sod dugouts. It was a hard winter, and cold and scurvy took their toll on the people. No accurate death count can be found. Looking at all of the different numbers that you can find, it's somewhere around 325 people that died in winter quarters that winter. So on April 7th, 1847, the day after the 17th anniversary of the founding of the LDS Church, Young set off from winter quarters with that group that I talked about a little while ago. There were supposed to be 12 men standing for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, but one man did back out because he got sick, and then 3 women, including one of Young's wives, Clara Decker Young, and 2 children joined at the last minute. It would take them 108 days to travel 1,031 miles from winter quarters to the site of their new Zion, which was an average of a little less than 10 miles per day, though the procession actually moved faster since every Sabbath was observed as a rest day. So this initial journey has become what he says the Mormon Odyssey, likened to Odysseus's voyage home from Troy. Yet, in many ways, it was routine. This is one of the things that I said at the beginning, that if you asked me what I knew about the pioneers, I would have thought there were hardly any pioneers going back and forth at this time. They would be all alone on the trail. And this is a really important thing that I learned. With the opening of the Oregon Trail in the early 1840s, the path along the North Platte, the Sweetwater River, and over South Pass became the standard route for immigrants flocking to homestead in what was still officially British territory. In 1843 alone, some 900 immigrants traveled to Oregon along the trail. Though not published until 1849, Francis Parkman's enormously popular The Oregon Trail recounted the author's journey of 1846, a year before the Mormon Exodus. The Donner Party also traveled along the trail that year, and in fact blazed the difficult route through the canyons of northeast Utah that Young's pioneers would follow in 1847. This was basically a highway of the time. There were a lot of people traveling it. And he says, indeed, the pioneer party under Brigham Young proceeded westward with relative ease. The few encounters with Indians were peaceful. There were so many bison to shoot that Young eventually had to scold his followers for wasting so much meat, as they left carcasses to rot on the plains. And as mythologized by the Mormons, the pioneers seemed to take place in isolation, as if those 148 pilgrims were pushing along the Platte and Sweetwater like explorers penetrating undiscovered realms. In fact, that spring and summer, there were no fewer than 5,000 immigrants walking and riding westward toward their own promised lands. The trail was so crowded that on April 25th, the Mormon Company decided to cross the Platte and continue on its north bank rather than follow the established and well-trodden route of the Gentiles on the south side of the river. This separation, so characteristic of the saints, would persist through the following years, so that along the Platte, the Mormon Trail came to be distinguished from the Oregon Trail proper. I've seen a lot of people talking about this, that if they hadn't done that, if they weren't so determined to not be on the trail with others, that it wouldn't have been as hard for them because they wouldn't have had as many river crossings. Brigham Young had a really strict military discipline in his vanguard company. The whole party was roused by 5 a.m. by the peal of a bugle. The team started moving at 7 after each wagon team had cooked a dinner to be consumed at noon. The wagons were parked at night in a precise configuration with the front wheel of one interlocked with the back wheel of another. They would have prayers, and by 8:30 and by 9, everyone had to be in bed with the fires extinguished. You weren't allowed to wander more than 110 yards from camp. By June 12th, the trekkers had reached what would come to be known as the last crossing, near where the Sweetwater entered the North Platte. Later in the season, the Platte would be low and braided enough to ford, but now swollen with spring snowmelt from its headwaters in the Medicine Bow Mountains, it was running 100 feet wide and 15 feet deep. It was here where today there's Casper, Wyoming, where the Martin Handcart Company would start to come to grief 9 years later. In 1847, it took the pioneer party 6 days of perilous ferrying to get across the Platte. The Saints had had the foresight to carry with them a leather boat that they called the Revenue Cutter, which could carry as much as 1,800 pounds. The cutter was up to the job of getting all the baggage across the river, but the wagons themselves presented a major problem. So the men experimented with lashing rafts together, finally building a raft big enough for the wagons, and then holding their breath as they went across. Young now turned his adversity into a business opportunity, and he ordered several of the men to stay behind, where they would charge $1.50 per wagon to ferry the scores of Gentile trains bound for Oregon across the flooding river. He talks in here about how at this point, whenever they did have to share the trail, that it would be so crowded that a lot of times there were racing to each other to see who could get the best campsites. On June 27th, the wagons crested South Pass, and that is over here. So they've gone all of this way and they're over here now. And this is where the Oregon Trail parted from the path that they were going to follow to Great Basin. They began to worry about getting lost, but they ran into some mountain men. One of them was Jim Bridger. Later on, they will have a run-in with Jim Bridger. Brigham Young will actually order some people to go and take over Fort Bridger, which is another thing of history I did not know. So that's an interesting bit of information to go look up if you don't know that story. But the Mormons did take over Fort Bridger, and Jim Bridger fled for his life from them. But at this point, he told them how to get through the canyons to the Great Salt Lake. And they actually found his directions to be very confusing, and so they eventually gave up trying to follow the directions he'd given them. But they would later come in contact with a man named Sam Brannan that would try to talk them into going all the way to California, and they said no to him, but he was able to also give them directions. So they knew exactly where they were going. Once across the Green River, the Saints had only 169 more trail miles to reach the site of their new Zion. So this would be the hardest traveling of all for them. None of it more arduous than the last 36 miles, as finding faint traces of the Donner Party's passage the year before, they literally built a road down what would come to be called Immigration Canyon. At this point, they had to slow down, and a lot of them got mountain fever. And like I said, that was something Brigham Young had. The best guess is that it was Rocky Mountain spotted fever that is caused by ticks. So they sent ahead an advance party of 22 wagons under Orson Pratt, while Young was carried slowly along on the bed of a wagon with the main party. On July 21st, Pratt's team broke through a last canyon barrier and suddenly gained its first view of the Great Salt Lake Basin spreading below. We could not refrain from a shout of joy, Pratt wrote. He goes on here to say that sometimes it's overlooked and not mentioned that they were technically going into a foreign country. He says invading and occupying a foreign country here, because all of this was still Mexican soil at this point. So then he says, this singular moment in LDS history furnishes the pedestal for the most potent and beloved of all the Mormon myths. According to that legend, on July 24th, 1847, Brigham Young beheld the Great Salt Lake Valley and at once announced, "This is the place." Today, July 24th, known as Pioneer Day, is the occasion for gala celebrations not only in Salt Lake City, but in every Mormon community. He said, alas, Young never uttered his most famous utterance. Historian Dale Morgan, combing the records of the pioneer days, found that the "this is the place" formula does not crop up before 1880, 33 years after, and three years after Young had died. What most people don't know is that when Brigham Young was wheeled into sight of the Promised Land on July 24th, the advance party had already plowed 3 acres of ground and planted the first seedlings. They had built a dam on what would be named City Creek and diverted water to the fields by means of irrigation ditches. Wilford Woodruff's journal for that day notes only that the prophet expressed his full satisfaction in the appearance of the valley as a resting place for the saints and was amply repaid for his journey. When I was first reading this, that blew my mind. Even having left the church, I still really thought that they didn't know where they were going and that he just got there and decided it was the right place. But obviously now we know they were already building there. They were already planting there. They knew where they were going before he even saw it. And I think that is a huge, huge piece of information that all Mormons need to know, especially because in this book about Gordon B. Hinckley that I quoted from earlier, on page 85, he said, "I stand in reverent respect for Brigham Young. He saw the Salt Lake Valley in vision long before he saw it with his natural eyes. Otherwise, I doubt he would have ever stopped there." And that goes along with what I was told growing up, that when he saw it, he recognized it, that that was where they were supposed to go. But they were already planting before he saw it. The next question that you might ask is why? Why gather everyone to this new place? Why not just have the saints that they already had in winter quarters come after him in wagons, and then they are all there? Why do later pioneers have to come? Why do all of the saints in Europe have to come? In a lot of my history videos, I've referenced the Saints book, which is a book of church history that the LDS Church has put out. They have started giving a little bit more information than they used to, but they still leave out a lot of stuff. The second book, which I don't own, so I'll put a picture up here, I went on the LDS Church website and I read through the chapters that had to do with this time period. And so one of the quotes in chapter 14 reads, "Immigrants like Nikolai were eager to come to Zion. not only because of their faith in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, but also because they wanted to escape the wickedness of the world and find a better life for themselves and their families in the Promised Land. Inspired by the American missionaries' enthusiastic descriptions of Utah, many of them pictured the Salt Lake Valley as a Garden of Eden and made every sacrifice to get there. So during this time, as missionaries are going to Europe and they're starting to convert a lot of the people that were converted in England especially were the poor people. They were very destitute. As Brigham Young is building up Salt Lake City and more missionaries are getting sent out, they are being told about this wonderful place. Of course, they're going to want to get there. Not only are they going to be surrounded by the people that believe what they believe, but they also think it's going to be like the Garden of Eden. They also were not told about, the women weren't told about polygamy. They weren't told most of the truths about Salt Lake City before they came. So they want to come. But it's not just that. And I'll get more into that in a minute. By early 1856, the Mormon authorities knew that this new place that they had created, that they're calling Deseret, that its hopes of becoming a state were doomed because of an unsympathetic Congress that had it out for them because of polygamy. Brigham Young had a lot of apprehension that the troops were going to invade their territory and take it away from them. And so the need to bring thousands of converted saints quickly and cheaply across the Atlantic from Europe and Great Britain had everything to do with the dream of building up a great Zion that could repel an invasion. He wanted to expand what he was building. So after his initial arrival here, he rested only 34 days in Salt Lake City before setting out on a return trail to winter quarters to bring more saints. They said that the saints of Britain and Europe must be gathered to Zion as soon as possible, for who could know how soon the apocalypse might arrive, subjecting every denizen of Babylon to the tribulations of the last days. There were political as well as spiritual reasons for the building up of the frontier theocracy. In settling the Great Basin, while it was still technically part of Mexico, they hoped that as they never could in New York, Ohio, Missouri, or Illinois, that they could flourish in their isolation. And on February 2nd, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo rendered Great Salt Lake City a breakaway colony planted on U.S. soil. In March of 1849, Brigham Young and his co-leaders declared the establishment of the state of Deseret. In 1850, there was a compromise with the U.S. Congress. They whittled Deseret down to an official Utah territory. It was 220,000 square miles, 2.5 times as large as Utah is today. And the compromise appointed Brigham Young to a 4-year term as the first governor. The dream of Mormon autonomy, however, would be dashed not by Congress as much as by a completely unforeseeable event, the California Gold Rush. At first, Brigham Young was trying to divert the Gold Rush people away from Salt Lake City. He didn't want them coming through. But then he realized that they would bring a huge economic benefit. The U.S. Census for 1850 recorded the non-Indian population of the Utah Territory as 11,380. But only about half of that were in Salt Lake City itself because Brigham Young had started sending people off to start little towns around the area. He says there were no fewer than 96 Mormon villages and settlements stretching from Fort Bridger in Wyoming to San Bernardino in California, but he was stating that the goal of the saints was to convert the whole world. Young sincerely believed in such a destiny. In a typical 1855 pronouncement, he proclaimed, "We will roll on the kingdom of our God, gather out the seed of Abraham, build the cities and temples of Zion, and establish the kingdom of God to bear rule over all of the earth." During this time, there was a lot going on in Salt Lake, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the last video. But one of the things that happened is in 1853, as he surveyed for a possible railroad route, Gunnison's party was ambushed in a desolate region of western Utah, near the present-day hamlet of Hinckley. The captain and 7 of his men were killed, their bodies mutilated. This was called the Gunnison Massacre. And it was suspected at the time, and is still argued today, that it was carried out by Mormons or by Indians acting under Mormon orders. There was a lot going on with the polygamy at this time, and it was widely rumored that the U.S. government, instead of admitting Deseret to the Union, would invade Utah with troops. This was not a paranoid thing. This was something that they really thought was going to happen from President James Buchanan. And it was during this time period that Brigham Young came up with the divine, as he called it, handcart scheme. Between the pioneer trek of 1847 and the last wagon train in 1855, no fewer than 150 separate companies of Mormon immigrants made the long voyage across the plains to Salt Lake City. Every such journey was perilous, and it was rare exception for a party to come through without having at least some death. But by the mid-1850s, a wagon typically cost $90, a yoke of oxen $70. Since it took 3 yokes to pull a fully loaded wagon, the cost of outfitting a family for the trail easily reached $300. To solve this problem, in 1849, Brigham Young and his fellow leaders invented the Perpetual Immigration Fund. This lent the necessary money to the immigrants to journey to Zion as an advance, and once they got to Utah, they would pay it back through money or labor, and they would be charged interest. What they failed to mention, and what people apologists for it today will still try to minimize, is that while the church coffers supplied much of the money, a substantial part of it was raised by the saints in Britain and Scandinavia that would donate every shilling that they had, and then the interest of 10%. So many saints would spend the rest of their life unable to pay back this loan or working toward that. This is much like the Perpetual Education Fund that they do now, where I knew that you could give money to this and they would help people from other countries to come here and get an education, but I never knew that they had to pay it back with interest to the church. So the church actually profits off of it. So members donate, that money is then paid back to the church, but then they also get more from that person. So the church might have that fund over and over and over again to use, but they also have a profit on every single person that does it. That obviously, that model is taken from this immigration fund. But it worked, and by the end of 1855, it had assisted 3,411 immigrants to get to Utah. But in that year, Young realized that the debt was $100,000 that was owed to the church by 862 saints who had not been able to pay it back yet. He needed a solution for that problem. It is kind of important to know and think about the fact that at this time, Brigham Young was quite wealthy. It is said that he was worth about $150,000, which would make him nowadays a millionaire. And he had these huge grand houses built in Salt Lake City. And yet he's trying to figure out how to save money for the church not to have to spend as much for people that are coming across. He saw the little carts that a lot of the gold rush people would pull along, and that gave him an idea. On October 29th, 1855, in the 13th General Epistle, a kind of State of the Union address issued once a year, Young and his two chief counselors announced the handcart plan. So he said, "We cannot afford to purchase wagons and teams as in times past. I am consequently thrown back upon my old plan to make handcarts and let the immigration foot it, and draw upon them the necessary supplies, having a cow or two for every 10. They can come just as quick, if not quicker, and much cheaper, can start earlier, and escape the prevailing sickness which annually lays so many of our brethren in the dust. If it is once tried, you will find it will become the favorite method of crossing the plains. They will have nothing to do but come along, and I should not be surprised if a company of this kind should make the trip in 60 or 70 days. I do know that they can beat any ox train crossing the plains." He seemed to have forgotten that in 1847 it had taken his hand-picked party of men that were really strong 108 days to travel from winter quarters to Salt Lake, and that was 300 miles shorter than the one the handcart pioneers would be taking, since they would start in Iowa City. He said 15 miles a day will bring them through in 70 days, and after they get accustomed to it, they will travel 20, 25, and even 30 with all ease and no danger of giving out, but will continue to get stronger and stronger. The little ones and sick, if there are any, can be carried on the carts, but there will be none sick in a little time after they get started. There will have to be some few tents. One important note here is that Young never claimed that the handcart plan was divinely inspired. Yet in the same issue of the Star, Richards leapt to the divine conclusion, "The plan is a device of inspiration," he told the British saints, "and the Lord will own and bless it." Within months of this plan coming to light, this was widely believed to have been passed down to Young in revelation from God. And it is still talked about that way. They decided on all of these things that they felt like these pioneers with handcarts could do, and they believed that 60 days would be about the medium time it would require to cross the plains. Richards emphasized that it was a sacred duty of the British saints to travel by handcart. A sacred duty. Mormons take that very seriously. He said, "They will be ready to prove by their works that their faith is worth more than the life of the body, the riches of the world, the phantoms of paganism." It was substantially cheaper than immigration by wagon. LDS scholar Andrew D. Olson calculated that compared to the $300 a family to buy a wagon and oxen, a handcart would only cost $10 to $20. So now that this plan has been announced, they're going to put it into place. Brigham Young, the prophet, put Franklin Richards in charge of organizing the immigration from Liverpool, Apostle John Taylor, the president of the Eastern Mission based in New York City, to be in charge of receiving the European saints upon arrival and sending them on their way to Iowa. Taylor, who had been severely wounded in the Carthage jail mob when Joseph Smith died, took his duties very seriously, and at once he dispatched elders William H. Kimball, Heber Kimball's son, and George D. Grant to Iowa City to superintend the building of the first 100 handcarts. Then Elder Daniel Spencer, a missionary just returned from England, to take charge of the whole Iowa operation. So I wondered, what would the church say about the Perpetual Education Fund on their website? If you went there and you wanted to know about this stuff I've been reading, what would you find? So I printed off these papers from the gospel topic parts of the LDS official church website. And under Perpetual Immigration Fund, it says the church inaugurated the Perpetual Immigrating Fund Company, PEF, in 1849. The PEF used church assets and private contributions to assist poor immigrants from the eastern U.S. and Europe on their journey to the Salt Lake Valley. The funds were extended as a loan rather than as a gift, and sponsored immigrants signed a note obligating themselves to repay their PEF after they arrived in Utah. This obligation could be met through cash, commodities, or labor. It is estimated that prior to its dismantling in 1887, the PEF assisted more than 30,000 people to travel to Utah by wagon, by pulling a handcart, or after 1869 by rail. What does it not mention there? What do they not tell you on the church website? They don't tell you about the interest. Under the article on their website called Gathering to Zion, they say people believed that this was an actual physical gathering of covenant Israel to a designated location where they would build a temple and establish Zion. President Young and the brethren created the Perpetual Immigration Fund in the fall of 1849. Upon arrival, the gathering converts would work on public work projects, repay their loan in cash, commodities, or labor, and thereby replenish the fund. It tells you that these people believed that it was their duty to come here because they are covenant Israel. And also, again, they don't mention the interest. In that saints book, it says, by the October 1855 General Conference, Brigham Young knew the saints in Utah Territory were in trouble. Grasshoppers had ravaged many of their gardens and fields, and the drought had destroyed what the grasshoppers had not. That's another thing that you'll find out as you learn true history of the church. We also have a huge legend about the Mormon crickets and how the seagulls came in and saved everybody. But they actually happened twice, and one time there were seagulls that ate a lot of them. Another time they did not. The seagulls did not show up. Dust clouds blew across the valleys, and wildfires burned through the dry canyons, destroying fodder for cattle. With no way to feed the ox teams hauling stone to the temple site, work on the house of the Lord ceased. Brigham and his counselors believed the drought and infestation were a gentle chastening from the Lord. Give heed unto the whisperings of the Spirit, and tempt not the Lord to bring upon us a heavier rod of discipline, they instructed the saints that fall, that we may more fully escape those judgments of high heaven's King. They go on to say immigration was expensive, however, and most of the new converts were poor and needed loans from the Perpetual Immigrating Fund. Unfortunately, the drought had wrecked the economy in Utah, which depended almost entirely on successful harvest. Robbed of their livelihood, many saints could not pay tithing or repay their loans to the fund, and soon the church accrued a steep debt by borrowing money to help finance the large wagon trains coming west that year. In the October 1855 epistle to the saints, the First Presidency reminded church members that donating to the Immigrating Fund helped to bring their fellow saints to a place where they could enjoy industry and honest labor. This is true charity, the presidency declared, not only to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, but to place them in a situation where they can produce by their own labor their subsistence. Brigham and his counselors urged the saints to donate what they could to the Perpetual Immigrating Fund. Aware that most saints could not contribute much, also they proposed a more affordable way to gather. Rather than coming to Zion with expensive oxen and wagons, future immigrants could come by handcarts instead. Pulling handcarts over the plains, the First Presidency explained, would be faster and cheaper than traveling by wagon. Each handcart would consist of a wooden box sitting on an axle and 2 wagon wheels. Since handcarts were smaller than wagons, the immigrants would not be able to carry as many supplies and provisions with them, but wagons from the valley could meet the handcarts partway to provide assistance as needed. Let all the saints who can gather up for Zion and come while the way is open before them, the First Presidency declared. Let them come on foot with handcarts or wheelbarrows. Let them gird up their loins and walk through, and nothing shall hinder or stay them. Brigham immediately shared the plan with Apostle Franklin Richards, the European mission president. I want to see it fairly tried, he wrote. If it is once tried, you will find that it will become the favorite mode of crossing the plains. On January 26, 1856, Apostle Franklin Richards published the First Presidency's epistle in the Latter-day Saints Millennial Star, the church's newspaper in England. As editor of the paper, Franklin gave his enthusiastic support to the handcart plan. The faithful poor in foreign lands have the consolation of knowing that they are not forgotten, he rejoiced. Since the earliest days of the church, the Lord had commanded the saints to gather together to prepare themselves for the tribulations preceding the second coming of Jesus Christ. Franklin believed that these hardships were coming soon and that the European saints needed to act quickly to avoid them. And in the Doctrine and Covenants, chapter 29, verses 8 through 11, it tells them that. It tells them that they need to gather. The most interesting thing to me about this is that this is what was told to the people. They believed that they were supposed to come here for the gathering before Jesus came again. Now, all these years later, Jesus still hasn't come yet, and we're no longer doing this. They're telling people, no, stay in your country. Stay in your country. We don't need to be here all in Zion. Knowing that some saints worried about the difficulty of gathering by handcart, he presented the proposal as a test of faith. He also reminded immigrants that the ordinances of exaltation awaited them in the endowment house. Come, all all ye faithful who have stood firm in storms and in calms, he declared. We are ready to welcome you home and bestow upon you those blessings for which you have long hungered. To wrap this first part of this series up with this video, this is a picture I got online. This is the wagon train packing list up here, and this is the handcart packing list. So you can see that the wagon train had not only a bunch of wagons and oxen, but they had milk and beef and tons of flour, weapons, sugar, mustard, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, salt, dried apples, beans, peaches, pumpkins, seed grain, soap, iron and steel, nails, cooking utensils. They had so many things here listed. A good tent, clothing and bedding. The handcart packing list is 17 pounds of baggage, which would include clothes, bedding, cooking utensils, etc. 1 pound of flour per person per day. This is a half a pound of flour. Each person would have 2 of these per day, 8 wagons, and 1 tent for every 20 people. So now we have set up the reasons. We've set up what has started to happen, what happened when they got here, and why Brigham Young has come up with this handcart plan that they are now going to start doing. So the next video, I will get right into the handcart companies.